Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm James Harding. I'm the editor and co-founder of Tortoise, and welcome to our weekly open news meeting. This used to be a meeting where it was pretty much only people who worked at Tortoise who'd get together in our newsroom in central London, and we would a little mark our own homework, have a think about how the stories we've been looking at are working and where they might take us next, and try and argue through a little of what we're missing. And then, as many of you will know, we just open that up. And what's been brilliant about doing it digitally is that we hear a different set of ideas, challenges to some of the ones that we've been thinking about. And that's what we'd really like to do in the next hour. So please do weigh in. If you've got thoughts on stories that we should be covering or angles on stories that we're missing, just type it into the chat. My colleague, the great Merrippy Mills, is here. She will pick up on that. There she is, look at that, doing that. She's typing and waving with both hands. That's how terrific she is. And we're gonna talk a little bit about the ideas that you bring to us. But we've also, in the last few weeks, innovated with a couple of other things. One is that we've opened up our news list. And what that is really is it's just a marker of a handful of things that we think are really big stories that probably aren't getting the attention they deserve. So if you look today in the Tortoise app, the Tortoise news list flags up what's happening in Hong Kong, and not just what we're hearing about TikTok and some of the other social media platforms, but specifically Facebook and WhatsApp and how they handle what's happening in Hong Kong. We flag up the real interruption that's likely to come from local lockdowns and the question of what are the terms for businesses and communities that shut down when a local lockdown, even a micro lockdown, is imposed. We flag up a number of the big international stories we're not looking at, specifically Libya, the UN's role, Turkey's role. I should just put our hands up to a wonderful typo of ours, which we're going to correct, but we have misnamed the Libyan National Army the Library National Army. We were just talking about the violent bookworms that we imagine are part of that Library National Army, so forgive us for that. The Libyan National Army, it should be. And we've also talked about the costs of vaccines and treatments, not just for COVID-19, but specifically for the people who are suffering from illnesses other than COVID, and the big issue of excess deaths, i.e. those that are not attributable to COVID, but go over and above the mortality rates we expect to see. All of those issues are on the news list. But the big one actually is the last one today. I suspect that you are going to enjoy this more than I am, in that we held a Tortoise Education Summit 2 weeks ago, and we said we'd come back with, if you like, a Tortoise take, a point of view on what the agenda should be vis-a-vis the changes in learning, a revolution in learning. And the main subject we want to come to today is an open argument about that. Are we, falling into the trap of dreamers? Are we going to get bogged down by kind of inertia and conservatism? What are the changes that we should address when it comes to education? I'm going to come to Chris Cook, turn to Claudia Williams and Kerry Thomas, who've worked on it, and try and hear your views on how we should take forward the Tortoise take on education, which likewise is in the app. But I'm going to start, if I can, with two things that I just think feel like they've opened us up to a chance to consider what's happened in the last 3 or 4 months. The file of the week, the reckoning, the impact that the coronavirus has had specifically on the UK, and the risk that in reopening pubs and reopening the economy, we don't dwell sufficiently on who's been hit and how hard, and also just on how much we don't know about this illness. And so if I can, Giles Whittell, I'd like to start with you. Giles is the editor of the Sensemaker email. And Giles, you put together yesterday quite a long list of the things that we just don't know. What do you think, given how much we don't know, we should draw in terms of how we look ahead at the next month, 6 months, year to 2 years?
Um, uh, we should I think the 2 years bit of that is key. We should expect still not to know a lot of fundamental science about how the virus acts on the body for that sort of time frame, not a matter of months. I think I'm always worried that expectations that we'll have a vaccine in months, not years, are over optimistic. Treatment may come quicker, but I started the list of things that we don't know with whether infection confers immunity, because this is fundamental. I'm no scientist, but it seems to be fundamental to the approach taken by most of the vaccine research efforts. We still don't know if infection confers immunity. If so, for how long? The extent to which the level of your exposure to the virus determines the level of antibodies in your system. It probably does, but again, there's no scientific consensus on that. And obviously, if infection or a vaccine only confers limited immunity, that means that the type of vaccine that we may be going to get will be much more like an annual flu shot than a once in a lifetime tetanus shot or once in 12 years tetanus shot. Huge implications for how the world gets vaccinated, how big the vaccine industry is going to be, but also the science of how this virus works on the body. It's getting a lot of attention, obviously, but we still don't know how it acts on the brain, how long neurological symptoms may last. I didn't name any names because I thought it would be in bad taste, but obviously this is a really key consideration where leaders and high-profile people get it and then are expected to keep working. And then finally, on the tracking of the disease front, it's a sort of separate category of ignorance. But because here, for example, we've done such a poor job so far of and delayed job of tracking and tracing, we don't know who's got it. We just don't know who's got it. And across sub-Saharan Africa, we still have no idea whether this is a continent that for some reason has very low infection rates, or possibly is comparable to ours, but a much higher level of proportion of those who have it showing no symptoms. So it's really, really fundamental unknowns. And the list, which I think has about a dozen categories of unknowns on it, could have been longer.
Yeah. I mean, I thought, Charles, for what it's worth, I thought that some of the things were just absolutely amazing to me, as in, we're not really sure where it originated or when it arrived in different parts of the world. But that remains quite so unclear. As you said, the long-term impacts on health, specifically on the brain, were absolutely extraordinary to me. And this whole question about how the antibodies do or don't stay in the system and do or don't work, and how asymptomatic people do or don't transfer. I mean, it just seems to me, I know scientists and people in the healthcare industry say, look, it's still a relatively new disease, we're learning a lot. But it's the fact that so many people are working so hard to study it and still so confounded by it. It just means that, I suppose, the only sensible thing to take from it is we're in for a lot more uncertainty.
Yeah, and the long haul. I mean, I shouldn't be, you only get gloomy or excessively gloomy if you expect medical miracles in weeks and months. Let's remember that the great vaccines that have immunized the global population against killer diseases have taken decades to develop. Let's remember that HIV is now a chronic condition that is treatable with the right drugs. Took a long time and with a tragic death toll to get there, but we got there. So it's not that these frantic scientific efforts are in any way doomed. We will proceed from a position of stunning ignorance to being able to manage the disease, but we may well end up managing it rather than eliminating it.
Yeah. Okay. Charles, thank you. I mean, I wanted to mention it to everyone because I just think also journalistically there's something I found really valuable with this in terms of fronting up at the start and saying at the end of what's been a period of lockdown, there's just so much we don't know rather than focusing on what we do. Dave, Taylor, can I bring you in too? Because in terms of what we do know, the thing that we have focused on this week has been what we call the reckoning. Do you want to just talk everyone through what we've done, what we think we've learned so far, what's yet to come in the week? And anyone who's got thoughts, please do weigh in.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I mean, as James said, the sort of starting point for it was, in the moment as Britain opens back up somewhat with pubs and the like, we wanted to go at those questions that we don't really feel have been resolved very well and probably aren't going to be solved by government done by three-word slogans. So the first piece that we kicked off with on Monday in the app was it's the story of a guy called Emmanuel Gomez, who was a cleaner at the Ministry of Justice, and we were lucky to work with a brilliant freelance journalist called Jack Schenker, who spent a couple of months on this story. And really what he's done is he's taken the experience of a group of cleaners who worked at the Ministry of Justice, and from that has drawn out a lot of truths about what the pandemic's told us about, that notion somehow that it was going to be the great leveler because it could even come for a prime minister in Downing Street was very quickly, I think, taken away. And I think we understood that, if you were a key worker or a blue collar worker and you had to keep going to work and showing up, you were in greater risk. And if you lived in a more deprived area and poor housing, all of those issues, and clearly with some demographic groups, Black and Asian and ethnic minority populations being more vulnerable. It all comes through in the story of the guys he talks about at the Ministry of Justice. I really recommend that as a stunning bit of journalism. And we've done a podcast together, which went up in the app today and is there for a couple of days before it goes into the App Store and everything else on Thursday. So again, I hope you'll really find lots to admire there and to think about. And then we've gone, there's a couple of amazing, really powerful picture essays that John Jones, our picture editor, has been nurturing, and my colleague Pete Hoskin has been writing around, and they're due to come in the middle of the week. One's really an examination of all the frontline workers at UCLH from top to bottom of the hospital, and the other one is actually shot by a member of hospital staff who happens to also be a photographer in his spare time, and he's done this wonderful essay that really homes in on one patient's progress, and it happens to be one of their colleagues who really sails very close to the line and almost loses her life but comes through. And then we've got again another great journalist, Louise Tickle, who is famous for being the most concerted journalist covering that sort of secret world of family courts in the UK. And she has done a really kind of worrying but deep look at young lives under lockdown, and noting that school was the place where adults get to actually have a sight of children every week, and that has gone from the picture. And then once you start to realize that social work and family courts and GP surgeries, all of those potential spheres where warning signs can be picked up, have all been absent. So it's really talking to a lot of people about their concerns about what's been happening behind closed doors. And then if you're still hungry, we've still got more. There's a really, again, I think a stunning piece that we're working on with Nazia Afzal, who I'm sure you probably know is a former chief Crown prosecutor. His brother died in April as a result of COVID-19, and I think he was particularly deeply affected by the fact that at the same time Dominic Cummings seemed to be riding roughshod over the regulations that he'd presided over. And as you'll know, Nazir has instructed lawyers to look at the decision-making process that Durham Police in particular went through over the Cummings case, where it was very quickly dismissed as a nothing to see here. He's got a lot to say, and again, I mean, an amazing personal story. So there's tons to go at, and I think we've had a strong week.
Dave, we do, and listen, thank you for going through it. I also wanted to bring you in because it's a really big and difficult thing trying to give us the capacity to understand the impact of this, partly because it's been so uneven. And so I was just an invitation to everyone who's joined us today. Do take a look at this file, The Reckoning. I know people will really be sort of forced to recalibrate the way they see this thing when they read Jack Schenker's piece on Emmanuel Gomez, but you will think the same when you read Louise Ticker on children and social care, and you'll probably read the same when you read Nazir Afzal too on his experience and his family's experience. And in particular, the anaesthetist come photographer who just charts what COVID does to a person, in this case a nurse, as you said, Dave, in that hospital, is, it really brings it home in a way. So that's a point to the things we're doing. I'm going to turn now, if I might, to, if you like, the kind of hard work of the hour, which is what we make of this education take. Now, I'm suspecting, as I said at the beginning, that you're going to enjoy this more than me, because it's going to be a chance to take apart what we've done and hopefully put it back together. But let me tell you what we were thinking. One was, over the course of a day 2 weeks ago at the Education Summit, we had more than 2,000 people join. Many, many people spoke. Lots of people made points in the chat. We were really lucky to have a huge host of people pointing us to research papers, op-eds, documents, etc. So we brought all of that together. There's an easy and lazy response to all of this, which is you just put it all out there. Right? The much harder job has been to try and distill it into a framework for thinking about how we approach education and a revolution in learning. And what we've done, and in particular Claudia Williams and Kerry Thomas have done, is to create what we described as a washing line, right? i.e. that's something that carries you from here to there in the argument that there is a revolution needed in learning. But on that washing line, we have some fresh ideas. And let's be honest, most of them are ideas that are not ours, but have been picked up from others that we think have merit. And some of them are not even new ideas, but ideas that have been around but never really properly implemented. And we don't go into this naively. We go into it with a real sense that people in the education sector work incredibly hard to improve the lives and of millions of people and our society. But when you look at the attainment gap in the UK, when you look at the extent to which your outcomes in education depend so much on where you start, it surely argues for some really fundamental changes. Now, before I come to what's going to be the show, if you like, which I suppose will be my colleague Chris Cook, who's much more experienced than all of us, or the rest of us in Tortoise, in thinking about education, talking about what's right in what we know and what's really wrong in what we're saying. I actually wanted to start with people who've already raised some points on the chat. So I can see Umar Hassan has made a point about a sort of what we're missing in terms of this particular framework. Ian Duffy too, and Alison Stancliffe and a few other people. Can I start, Alison, with you? Are you there? I can't see whether you've got your camera on, but there you are. But you started with what I know well from being edited from fellow editors, which is the word, or maybe it's the sound So will you expand on your what you think that means in terms of the framework we've set up?
Well, I suppose, you know, at the education thinking, I said, I think I contributed by saying I felt like a dinosaur. And I think what I feel is it's pretty self-evident, and you have stated it there, what I think makes a good education for children. But these ideas have been tried. Mm. And so what I'm interested in is, in a sense, why have they not worked? Take citizenship. I mean, that was Labour's big thing when they came in the 90s. And David Blunkett went for it hell for leather, advised by a wonderful mentor of his. Why has it failed? Why has it become the subject in schools? You know, why it's been there all these years. So if we want to look at citizenship, it's about being revolutionary in thinking, how can you make it work? How can you make those children feel part of a society? David Lammy was really powerful about that, wasn't he, last week in his thinking?
Yeah.
And it's the same oracy. Oh boy, yeah, we went for in English, and a big thing with oracy, and it was supposed to go right through the whole curriculum. Why did that fail? I'm not in touch enough to know, but the reasons will be there. The good practice will be there. So it applies to quite a number of things that were said. So I'm really encouraged to see that we all still believe in the same things about what good education is. But I think to blandly say, oh, we need a national curriculum is not good enough even at this starting point. We need to do a lot more research, which is out there and easily available, I think, to look at why things work or not. And so I see this as a great starting point, and I feel horrible saying, I feel like a teacher saying, well, that's good.
No. By the way, I had a brilliant editor when I started out as a reporter at the FT who wasn't even as kind as that, Alison, would just pass me back, would print out what I'd written and just hold it out, and I just had to go and pick it up, and that meant start again. And so I remember doing pieces again and again like that. So.
Yeah.
Don't
start again, but do talk. I think it is interesting how the core, you could go to any people with education experience around the world, and you'd come to really pretty similar ideas.
Well, I suppose I tell you what.
Society in which it works, that's what the pivot is. And just to say, I mean, that was the thing. I think, again, I said at the summit, but it was so amazing that it's a political take on education is so important and directs where it's going. And if that's the case, how do we're back to democracy, and how do we influence and have our voice?
Well, listen, Alison, the one thing I do want to say is that what you have got is exactly the spirit of it, which is it is intended to be a starting point. Someone like me who's not a specialist in education, who's deeply worried about outcomes for the country and people in it, I find myself really intimidated by education and people in the education debate, because I don't feel like there's often a framework that I can understand for understanding where different changes need to come. And so what we've tried to do is create a structure for that, with then more specific ideas. And perhaps you're right, some of the ideas we're proposing we should also be making clear, and this is where and why they haven't worked before, but we think they're worth persevering with. I'm going to bring a few more people in, if I may, and I think I see that Sir Tim Brighouse is here, who's probably knows more about education reform than most of us. And so I'd love to ask you, Tim, how you would structure this, how you would argue for the reform that you think's needed. Tim, what do you think we should? How do you think we should structure it?
When you gave your kind of image of a washing line with things hanging from it, which I liked, I think, as you said, we need to categorize bits of the system. So is it around governance? Is it around finance? Most importantly of all, what are the purposes and aims of education? I mean, if you looked at somewhere like Australia, they're very clear about it, and it's very brief and succinct, and they're politically as active as we are. But if you look at the United Kingdom, there are no agreed aims or purposes for what we're doing, either in the schooling system before or after. There aren't any in the United Kingdom. There are 4 separate systems, and they perform differently. And if I were critical at all of your summary, it would be that you kind of implied that what you were talking about was the United Kingdom as though it were a homogeneous system, and it isn't at all. So I think it's perfectly possible to categorize on your washing line certain areas that we need to explore to get right. The biggest of those, in my view, is governance structures and the power. We've had more than 50, about exactly 40 years of centralizing our system and taking power away from the locality. That's in England, not true of Scotland or Wales. And I think there are benefits to that, and there are enormous disbenefits, if there is such a word. And we need to tackle that. Now, in this autumn, educationalists need to know that 2 white papers are coming out, one on further education and the other, far more important, on devolution. And it's that devolution debate that might mean that there is more democratic input below the level of Westminster. And Westminster, after all, is running a system of 47 million for 47 million people, which is the biggest system without any devolved power, except to individual institutions, of any in the Western developed world. So I think that's a key issue to get right. And I think there are plenty of examples from elsewhere of systems that have articulated principles and structures that enable the curriculum and their assessment system and accountability to be much better than it is in England. Though again, I say not about the United Kingdom.
Tim, we've tried to at the top of make the point that in all 4 nations of the UK, you see different versions of this attainment gap. But can I just ask, but I do appreciate the point that we probably haven't stressed clearly enough those differences. Can I just ask a specific question about devolution? Do you have a view on what the optimum level of that devolution should be, i.e. population size or geography? How do you think, and what examples are there elsewhere in the world of what the level of devolution is that really works?
Well, in English-speaking countries, you've got examples, and I'm not saying they're the right ones, but you've got different systems in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, Australia, Canada, all heavily influenced by our system in the distant past when we were less centralized than we are now. Yeah. And it seems to me it'd be perfectly possible to look at those as well as the much beloved learning from Estonia, Finland, Singapore, etc., and say what's going well in these different countries and how different is the attainment gap in those different countries. And then it tackled some of the other issues apart from governance and aims and purposes, curriculum, trust of the professionals, and an appropriate accountability system. Now, I think that if we're to take it on, the best opportunity of doing it is in the autumn with the devolution article, white paper, and in the knowledge that it is the 150th anniversary of the state in our country deciding to educate anybody. That was the Forster Education Act. So it's a wonderful opportunity to get a bit of a handle on this issue.
Well, for what it's worth, I have to say that I'm instinctively persuaded by the idea of devolution, not knowing nearly enough about education, but being really struck in the course of this pandemic, overall at the failure of the nation state, that either things need to be decided at a global level or much more locally. And it makes sense to me that education fits into that. But Tim, listen, thank you. And I hope that what we can do is start adding to things on that washing line, and where you see things, what we really want on the washing line are concrete ideas that are quite specific, that have a proven record of working. And I take your top point too, which is articulating what the purpose of education is. So we'll pick that up as well. Before I come to Chris, Umar Hassan, I said I'd hear from you, and I see that, Umar, you've made a couple of points. Are you there? Have you got a camera? There you are. Hello.
Yeah, hello. It's my first newsroom, so I think I'll just make it up as I go along, I guess, James.
We're all doing that. Welcome.
Okay, thank you. So a couple of points I wanted to make were, because I was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome since I was 3, and I'm still working in the journalism industry as we speak. I think a lot of my educational experiences were I was very fortunate in that the local because how you get a special educational needs statement is you go to the local authority, and then you would sort of, I don't think you'd be sort of diagnosed by a pediatrician or something, and then it would go through that. But it's all very bureaucratic, and you have to go through quite a lot of work. And that was in about the late 90s, early 2000s, I believe. So one of the big issues here with sort of in regards to learning disabilities in education is why are young people with learning disabilities sort of being left to the scrap heap because of COVID? Because I think people with learning disabilities in education have always sort of been, let's just say, they're sort of a nice to have, but then nobody's really going to bother about them. So it's quite interesting if we get to a post-COVID world, how people with learning disabilities will sort of be educated in that sort of sense, because it is a very sort of timely issue. And I think as well, I think Ian Birrell's covered quite a lot around learning disabilities and being locked up in sort of care homes. So if this comes down to the current path, are we just going to see more and more people with learning disabilities left just to be hidden away in care homes, or left on the streets, so to speak?
Umar, thank you. Listen, thank you so much. I mean, I'm really struck by what you say, because we need to work out how we're addressing that, because we talked a lot about how we learn, and we probably haven't talked enough about who teaches us, who gets to teach us, but also who gets to learn, right? Which is absolutely central to your point. And as you say, we've done a fair bit with Ian previously, but I think we should probably follow up. And my fellow editor Polly Curtis has been a great champion of exactly this subject. So we'll do that. I'm gonna just bring in, if I may, just a couple of others. Partly Ian Duffy, partly because you've been straight out the blocks in our stream of chat talking about this and how you see things. Ian, are you there and able to weigh in? Hello. Oh my! Is that actually the backdrop, or is that something that you've dropped in?
That masks out the chaos of kids running behind.
Is it? Oh, I thought
to some of the things I'll say.
Okay, far away.
So I agree with Tim for a starting point. I think having a purpose for education is really, really important. And for me, where it comes down to is the intersection of citizenship, economic productivity, and well-being. And if you focus on those 3 dimensions, I think you end up in the right place for then curriculum design, how you support children. Where I think your write-up, and I'm not just handing it back to you like an editor, where I think the write-up misses it is it's entirely assumes that there's a level playing field after the early years, and particularly through primary school. But that's where the divides open up and then accelerate away. In the kind of pre-read for the Education Summit, it talked about some of the biggest impacts being around poverty and free school meals, and then the divides coming out of that, and then particularly then the in-school variation. The other thing I think, and Tony P in the chat talked about this a bit, there's a lot of emphasis on skills development as opposed to knowledge acquisition, but they don't come in that order. And that's often overlooked, quite often by people who have an agenda around pushing a skills-led approach and who are rarely working in schools anymore.
Who are rarely working in schools?
Who are rarely working in schools anymore. So if you're talking about all the skills that they're calling for, and whether it's written up in the World Economic Forum or in quite a lot in the EdTech sector, it's all about independent learning, flipped learning, use of technology, kind of critical thinking, but that all has to be based on something. I think there's some useful stuff in kind of sociology that's worth looking at. So Louise Archer at UCL has done a lot of work on science capital and cultural capital, and Christine Council has written about cultural capital in the context of curriculum development. So they're really important, because they start to help you address some of those divisive factors early on around socioeconomic circumstance and poverty. I think lockdown's been a really interesting example. We've seen quite a lot of write-ups of the digital divide that's got way, way wider. Yeah. And so a lot of the things in the readout are calling for greater use of technology and greater use of independent learning, but they make massive assumptions that there's level playing field to start with.
So you're if I understand it right, which is pretty compelling, Ian, your argument is if you're going to start and make a case for a revolution in learning, your primary jumping off point should be the inequality in both the starting point, but how that progresses through the system.
Yes.
And your agenda should be driven by trying to address that inequality.
Yes.
Okay.
Because I think teachers and schools do a fantastic job already. A lot of the criticisms of the curriculum, again, are not from people who are immersed in the curriculum. And there's actually a huge amount of flexibility in the national curriculum and the approach around that that isn't fully exploited. But making sure that it is exploited. So not defending Ofsted here, but the recent change to require schools to be able to justify and articulate their approach to curriculum choice relevant to local circumstance, to the young people they've got, the communities in which they live and operate. That hasn't been seen through yet, but that actually should address all of the criticisms that were in the readout around curriculum and what should be in it and what shouldn't be in it. Okay,
that's great. Ian, thank you. Christina, I'm going to pronounce your name, Friedberg or Friedberg? I don't know. Are you there? Is Christina there? Hello, Christina.
Yes, hello.
Hello. I just wanted to hear what you make of it all.
Right. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you well.
Okay. So what I make of it so far is that for people who joined or at least part of the education conference, it seemed to me that everyone ignored the only radical speaker, and sorry, I can't remember the name of the first lady who spoke just now, in this hour.
Alison, yes.
Alison, yeah. So when Alison said, same old, we've done it all before, then I have 30 years experience of teaching in various different settings, including New Zealand and Pakistan. And the only speaker that I thought brought anything new to the table on the conference day was Professor, what was his name? Professor, right, I did earmark it here. He was Chinese.
Yong Zhao.
Yes.
Yes.
Because what he said, now I'm trying to find, sorry, I'm disorganized with my notes. What he said was that, what did he say? He said, he made three main points. One of them was, he was suggesting not having a curriculum at all, and students becoming self-determining citizens. And there was a really good, there was a young girl who gave an example of that, where she had been in some situation where her self-directed learning was, it was to do with Black history and those kind of things. And it obviously really worked for her. The second point that he made was a very COVID current way of thinking, I suppose. I'm just reading from my notes. Learning does not have to occur in school. And small learning communities were more effective, and not just in Norway or Finland, but not having things on such a massive scale. And the disaster of having whatever they call them, those schools where you have like a lead school and satellite schools around, which is still current in the UK, is really not working at all. And then he made he made another point, which was to do with, because somebody asked, oh, okay, so where is this actually happening? How would you actually do this? And he gave some examples of schools in Australia and in China where they were following, broadly speaking, what he saw as the new approach. So all I really wanted to say was that myself, I have had experience in various different settings, class settings, ethnic minority settings, traveller settings. My last paid employment was something called a resource teacher for learning and behaviour in New Zealand, which was basically problem solving for children who the school was unable to support, let's say. And that was basically bringing together the family, the school, the child being key. So that's another thing that I found with the speakers of, you know, it's been, all of it is really fascinating, but people don't really seem to mention the child's role, apart from this professor. So that's my take.
Oh, well, okay. Well, I mean, look, it's a very, it's I think what they call a good challenge, Christina, in the sense that have we shied away from enough radicalism? I'm going to turn to my colleague Chris Cook, if I might, because Chris, I think we might file all of this under "I told you so," as in you told me, that it's incredibly hard to navigate your way through this, and either you do something that's 20,000 words and extremely detailed and impossible to wade through, or you oversimplify, and we may have ended up there. Tell me, why don't you go for the critique of the sort of approach we've got, but more helpfully, actually, if you were trying to run through the changes the education in the UK and the four nations the UK need, what you would prioritise?
Okay, so it might be a start the other way around, actually. So I think one of the things that's totally underappreciated in this argument is the novelty of our education system. And I mean that in the literal sense, right? So when my father went to school, we didn't have a secondary school system. If my mother was actually a teacher, if she'd become a teacher immediately from university, she wouldn't have needed a degree. When my eldest sister went to school, we didn't have, only a third of people took exams at the age of 16. You know, most, or took exams with labour market value, I should say, took O-levels, I really mean, in England. When I went to school, we didn't have inspection, bluntly. The school system as we understand it today, one that is supposed to operate for all children, for the whole ability spectrum, and nationally across the whole country, across England, I'm really talking about, and one where standards are high standards and a professionalized graduate workforce is the norm, is incredibly new. And one of the people sort of think about the people talk about going back, if you like, to polytechnics, right? That's one of the sort of things in the ether. Polytechnics are only invented in the mid 1960s, right? The idea that what is old is sort of permanent is a sort of weird conservatism. Everything we are doing in education is novel and new because we're trying to do it at scale and at mass with a large graduate workforce. And I think you have to, the career of Tim, who spoke earlier, who is a very esteemed education reformer, has, if you like, been trying to navigate through to high standards for everyone, and trying to build a teaching workforce that can deliver that. And we're still trying to work out how to do it. It didn't used to work. We didn't try particularly. It doesn't work now, but we're still building it. And it's obvious when you talk about higher education perhaps being in a funny place because we've expanded so fast in the last few decades, but actually everywhere is in a similar place. And I think that's important because, so when you look at, say, Umar's experience, our difficulty of dealing with special needs are actually, it's one of the things we haven't figured out yet. And we should be relaxed about the fact that we haven't figured it out. We should be trying to fix things, but things didn't used to be better, and we have to find new ways to make things better. So in a sense, it's a sort of, I think the history should make you more radical, if you like, in terms of how you
so then Chris, then tell us what do you do? So be radical. Tell us what a radical set of changes looks like.
So I think the the boring truth is really hard not to be quite incremental. So I think, as Tim says, you need some form of accountability locally. That national, trying to drive standards nationally is really difficult. But also, we kind of know that if you make it part of the local authority, where most people are voting on how their bins are put out, that doesn't really work. It's really difficult to. There's nowhere it's sort of cracked it. But and lots of the things we need to sort of talk about are really cultural. So one of the things that came up in the chat was I talked previously about how education is a last mile service, right? So
yeah,
the most of the child's life is not in the school, and what you're doing is you're taking, potentially a smart, well-behaved child, and you're getting them to sort of higher grades, and the school is only doing a very small portion of the job. We underestimate the extent to which that's true. We also underestimate the extent to which actually the school system is quite good at that stuff. Despite its many flaws. Actually, England has, if you look at education attainment, the link between your parents' education and your attainment is lower in England than it is in Germany. So a more equal society, Germany, has a more unequal school system. Once you leave school, the poor kids stuff it even if they've got good grades. That's one of our. So the ability of the school system to overcome inequality is limited. But even when they do quite a good job, society pushes them back down again.
Pushes back.
So I think that's a slightly pessimistic.
Yes.
But
because Chris, here's the point that I'd make to you, which is to say, okay, I understand it's incremental. I understand that a lot of these things, as you say, are new. But if you still start with the point that Ian was making, which is, and the point that I think Kerry started with, which is look at the attainment gap, look at how closely where you end up depends on where you started in socioeconomic terms. You can't be satisfied with a set of changes that are incremental. So what would you do, and is it possible to do things that fundamentally change that outcome?
Well, I think one of our weird things in Britain is that we have we don't like to face up to the fact that if you want to really change, if you want to signal in not just in our society, but in any society, an interest in a thing, right? You put your money where your mouth is, right? So the countries with very good technical training are the ones that spend as much on it as they spend on academic training, right? Countries that have good teachers tend to spend more on teachers, but also they tend to have higher prestige for teachers. But these are sort of, I mean, I'm slightly skeptical. I don't think there's a one bound and we're free set of policies you can implement. I think driving things down to more local levels, there's more local accountability, spending more on education, basically, and actually, I really strongly believe in a national curriculum, which would probably be quite a knowledge-heavy national curriculum. And I also think that should be a political document. That's like part of the point of the school system is us telling schools what they should be teaching. So it should be open to debate.
Right.
And we should be sheepish about telling teachers how to teach. So I don't feel confident. We shouldn't have views on whether like one operation is better than another for appendicitis, right? And similarly, we shouldn't have views. There shouldn't be in the domain of politics that people argue about how to teach spelling.
Right.
But we should be able to say you should learn about the following 10 things. But I think that's a reasonable
distinction.
Yeah.
Okay. Chris, thank you. I sense that we may not be getting to the end of this discussion. I have to tell you, but to the beginning of it. But Kerry, Thomas, are you there? Because you and I have wrangled this, and Claudia too. Do you want to just sort of tell us some of the calculations you're making, trying to get us to where we are now?
Yeah, I mean, I think it seems to me if there's one thing that's definitely hanging on your washing line at the moment, it's me. That it's been a fascinatingly difficult thing to do this as someone who hadn't spent a lot of time at all thinking particularly about some time in HE, but below that, not a great deal. And I think when you start tucking into it, what's obvious is that there's no shortage of evidence in education. but that actually there's so much of it, you can use it to make just about any case you like. So I was very struck with some of the things that Ian Duffy said. I mean, I think actually we started from the same place. So you know, Tortoise, we talk a lot and think a lot about the power gap, and if there's inequality in access to resources, access to finance, in education, in a whole bunch of ways. It's one of our preoccupations, and it's always seemed to me that the best answer to the power gap is going to lie in education somewhere. And the reason I think that the attainment gap matters, because the attainment gap is a power gap, and it's the entrenchment of an existing power gap, and that is why it's fundamentally worth caring about. And although, as Chris has said and other people have said, the picture in England is that the attainment gap has narrowed somewhat. Still, when you look at the figures, that by the end of primary school, you can have an attainment gap between kids from poor backgrounds and rich backgrounds of 9.5 months. And as Ian said, we failed perhaps to acknowledge fully in the document that I wrote, that then accelerates through secondary school till you get to 16 plus, and you can have an attainment gap of, I think, of 19.5 months. Those are enormous variations between young students from different socioeconomic backgrounds. And I think it's fair, despite the progress, to call that out as a failure, even if it's not a uniquely British failure or English failure or Welsh failure or whatever. I think also that it's reasonable for us to given the malleability of the evidence, to say what kind of future are we fitting our education towards. So I liked Ian's framing of it: citizenship, economic productivity, well-being. I think that seems a neat sort of triumvirate. But I think you can already see the gaps we can see the gaps already in the citizenship curriculum. If you look at the big debates about climate, about post-Black Lives Matter, about a whole host of things, you can see that about Britain's place in the world, you can see how we have felt ill-equipped and undereducated to participate in some of those huge debates that are so important. So I think it does seem to me that Ian quite rightly said that that you have a sort of knowledge first camp and a skills first camp. I think that's a false dichotomy. That actually, clearly in the end, we're talking about a mix that's going to deliver both. But that we're within our rights to say, if we look forward 15 or 20 years to the kind of society, the kind of workplace that we imagine we're going to be, that it is worth saying that certain things seem to me are likely to be more important. So interdisciplinary thinking is likely to become more important in 20, 25 years than it was 20 or 25 years ago. That the kind of qualities that we're looking for in people, understanding, compassion, resilience, all those things are probably likely to be more important, not less. And that just puts a finger on the scales of that debate about knowledge and skills to me, and says that we have to care a great deal more than we have in the past about those kinds of qualities as part of the mix. We're running out of time, so I'll stop there, James.
Kerry, thanks. And just to say, Kerry is kind of understating how much we've worked to try to distill what we've got, and the reason for it being that we didn't think it was much good giving a laundry list rather than a washing line. Just giving loads and loads of ideas, but trying to actually create a framework for it. There are a couple of people who've got their hands up. Bex Cotty, I see you've had your hand up for a while. Are you still there? And have you got your camera on so you can weigh in?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Hello, Bex. Thanks so much. Sorry to keep you.
That's right.
What did you want to say?
Well, we're just going about the subject about what is taught on the curriculum and how we're teaching, and we're talking about skills. Throughout my life, I've had an incredibly varied career, and I wouldn't ever say that, I'm not a doctor, so I've not gone to university and studied medicine, and then I only do medicine for the rest of my life. I've done everything from, I've been a teacher, I was going to be a psychologist, and then we moved country, and I've taught to different languages. I then worked in sales. I've then had my own business. I've then moved into the NHS. So life is very varied. We already know that. We
Mm.
no longer have life is not about a single job career. Very rarely is it a single job career anymore. So we need to be giving kids the skills to actually adapt. And that isn't just about saying, these are the things that you need. It's about saying, what is it that society needs? You know, and that's about people that have skills of, we talked about communication or oratory skills, but that's communication on many levels. It's about communication, about listening to people as well as talking to people, being able to get points across, but also being able to accept other people's perspectives and so on. And we were talking in the chat a little bit there about somebody we were talking about, and it could go off on a completely different subject, about times tables. Kids don't know how to do times tables anymore. Can't do times tables. I could never do times tables at school. And it wasn't until somebody taught me different ways of managing that, that, you know, you have the skill then later when I need to calculate X multiplied by Z, that I can do that. I don't need to learn how to do times tables. So, you know, and I just think part of the solution to this is about taking the children's individual needs, and that goes throughout life, not just as a child, and giving them access to the different methods of doing things. We don't give it a child-centered approach enough. And I've seen in other education systems around the world, classrooms are much more staffed. You know, it's not one teacher and one classroom assistant to 35 kids, because how can that one teacher under so much pressure be teaching multiple methods of doing something?
So, well, Bex, there's so much in there to think about how much we change in our lives, how do we build an education system for that, what do we teach. I'm really struck by the tone that Chris took in terms of humility about how to teach, but a clarity about what's expected when you come out of our schools and education system. We're coming up towards the end of our hour, and there's something massively helpful for us in this, because we've not done this before. We've done, if you like, open think-ins where we've discussed a subject, an idea, and we've brought a set of notes to it. We haven't brought a Tortoise readout, a take on what we think should happen next. And it's incredibly useful, and I think means that we probably need to think about how we progress it. So we take on these points and we have something that has a structure that's easily digestible, but some detail that's actually helpful, and we'll do that. Will you forgive me? I see that William Jeremy's had his hand up, and Tony P too, and forgive me, we didn't quite get to it. I do want to say that even while we're talking, there are points that are being made in the chat that are fantastically useful. I starred Andrew Girdwood's point about Scotland and anti-English feeling in Scotland. It's a subject that we've been murmuring along. I know Jot Whittel has been keeping an eye on that too. We will definitely come back to that, Andrew. So don't worry about that. I'm going to do one very final thing, which I don't know whether Jack Schenker is actually here, who wrote the Emmanuel Gomez story. But Jack, if you are, let's finish up just with you, because I think you've just been on Radio 2 talking about it. Hello, Jack. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, James.
You come from the glamour of Jeremy Vine to the world of the newsroom. Just tell us what's the reaction been like to the story? Has there been much follow-up?
It's far more glamorous here with the rest of the Tortoise colleagues. But yeah, so the Jeremy Vine interview is actually now going to happen on Thursday. But there's been a fantastic response to the story so far. And David Lammy, the Shadow Secretary of State for Justice, has called for an investigation. We've seen a lot of play on social media with people picking up on the story, not just because it's a compelling injustice in its own right, but also because I think it resonates with a lot of questions people have about what sort of country is going to emerge from the pandemic and what the fault lines are going to be that we need to explore. And I know Tortoise has been doing a fantastic job, not just with this story, but with the other things it's been focusing on looking at some of those divisions and inequalities, and especially as we discuss, how we emerge from lockdown and what kind of society we want to see, those questions are going to become even more important.
Jack, well, thank you. We will listen out on Thursday, and just to say, for anyone who hasn't read it yet, when you read it, you'll realise what a meticulous and serious piece of reporting Jack did. So a huge thank you to you, Jack, and a big thank you to everyone who's joined us today. Thank you very much. Just to let you know, we've got what I think will be in a totally different realm, but something rather uplifting this afternoon, which is the great Lem Sisse is joining us for a think-in. We will talk about, yes, social care and the nature of the society we live in, but also poetry and how we understand ourselves. So please do join that 6:30 this evening. But for now, have a very good afternoon and a good day, everyone. Thanks so much.